The summer rain drummed against the grimy windows of the Coach and Horses pub in South London. Inside, cigarette smoke hung thick in the stagnant air, mixing with the smell of spilled beer and dampness that seemed to seep from the very walls. 6 people sat scattered across the cavernous room like lost souls in purgatory. 6. In a venue that could hold 200, only 6 had bothered to show up on this miserable Tuesday evening in 1970. At 24, Freddie Mercury stood backstage, though backstage was really just a narrow corridor behind a makeshift curtain that had seen better decades. His reflection stared back from a cracked mirror, dark eyes burning with an intensity that the empty room beyond seemed determined to extinguish. His bandmates clustered around him, their frustration palpable in the cramped space. Brian May leaned against the wall, his homemade red special guitar hanging from his shoulder like a question mark. Roger Taylor sat on an overturned crate, drumsticks tapping nervously against his thigh, in a rhythm that spoke of anxiety rather than anticipation. John Deacon, the newest member, simply stood silent, his bass guitar case unopened at his feet. This was supposed to be their breakthrough year. They had changed their name from Smile to Queen, a decision that had raised eyebrows and sparked debates in the underground music scene. They had spent countless hours in rehearsal rooms that smelled of mold and broken dreams, crafting songs that they believed could change the world. But here, in this nearly empty pub, reality crashed down upon them with the weight of indifference. The venue manager, a heavy-set man with yellowed teeth and a perpetually stained apron, had approached them 20 minutes earlier with barely concealed irritation. The gate receipts would barely cover the electricity bill, he had muttered, suggesting they pack up and call it a night. After all, what was the point of performing to an audience that could fit around a kitchen table? Even the bartender seemed more interested in cleaning glasses than watching whatever was about to unfold on the tiny stage. Brian was the first to voice what they were all thinking. Perhaps they should just leave, pack up the equipment, drive back to their shared flat, and pretend this humiliation had never happened. The logical part of every musician's brain understood the mathematics of failure. 6 people meant £6 at the door if they were lucky. 6 people meant playing to an audience smaller than most family gatherings. 6 people meant that everything they had worked for, dreamed of, sacrificed for, was perhaps nothing more than delusion dressed up in rock and roll clothing. Roger nodded in agreement, his usual bravado nowhere to be found. Even he, the most confident of them all, seemed deflated by the sight of those empty chairs stretching endlessly toward the back of the room. They had played to larger crowds in university pubs, in friends' basements, even busking on street corners had drawn more attention than this. The silence between them grew heavy, punctuated only by the distant murmur of conversation from their tiny audience and the occasional clink of glasses from the bar. But Freddie remained unnaturally still, staring at that cracked mirror as if it held secrets that only he could decipher. His fingers traced the edge of the makeup compact he had bought with his last few pounds, the theatrical touches that set him apart from every other aspiring rock singer in London. While his bandmate saw failure, Freddie saw something else entirely. In those 6 faces beyond the curtain, he glimpsed possibility. In that vast emptiness, he sensed potential. The venue itself told a story of faded glory. Once, perhaps decades ago, this had been a proper music hall where real performers had commanded real audiences. The ornate molding near the ceiling, now chipped and water-stained, hinted at better times. The stage, though small and scarred, had been built for performance. Someone, sometime, had dreamed of magic happening in this very room. Those 6 audience members represented more than disappointment to Freddie. They represented faith. 6 people who had braved the rain, who had chosen to spend their evening here instead of at home or at the larger venues down the road. 6 people who might witness something unprecedented. 6 people who could become 6 believers, 6 evangelists, 6 voices spreading word of what they had experienced. The pub's acoustics, despite its shabby appearance, were actually quite good. The high ceilings and hardwood floors would carry their music beautifully, perhaps better than the cramped carpeted rooms they usually played. The stage lights, dim though they were, still cast that magical glow that transformed ordinary people into performers. Everything they needed was here, everything except the crowd they had hoped for. As the minutes ticked by, Freddie's reflection began to shift in that cracked mirror. The disappointed young man gave way to something more determined, more defiant. His dark eyes hardened with resolve, and slowly, deliberately, he opened that makeup compact and began to prepare for the performance of his life. The pub was nearly empty. 6 people scattered across worn wooden chairs, nursing their drinks in the dim light of a London evening in 1970. On stage, 4 young men stood with their instruments, staring out at what most would call failure. Their equipment hummed with anticipation, but the venue felt hollow, almost mocking their dreams of stardom. This was Queen, though they barely knew what that name would come to mean. And in this moment of crushing disappointment, 24-year-old Freddie Mercury was about to make a decision that would define not just his character, but the very essence of what it means to be a performer. Brian May shifted uncomfortably behind his homemade guitar, its red body catching the stage lights. He exchanged glances with Roger Taylor, whose drums sat ready but whose enthusiasm was visibly deflating. John Deacon, the newest member, looked toward the exit as if calculating how quickly they could pack up and leave. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken doubt. This wasn't what they had imagined when they booked the gig. This wasn't the breakthrough they had hoped for. This was embarrassment, pure and simple, but Freddie stood differently. While his bandmates slouched with disappointment, he remained upright, his dark eyes scanning those 6 faces in the audience with the same intensity he might reserve for 60,000. His stage costume, carefully chosen despite their limited budget, caught the light as he moved. There was something in his posture that suggested he saw something the others couldn't. Where they saw failure, he saw opportunity. Where they saw waste, he saw purpose. Brian was the first to voice what they were all thinking. The mathematics professor turned musician had always been logical, practical. He leaned toward Freddie and whispered that maybe they should call it off, pack up the equipment, and try again another night at a better venue. Roger nodded in agreement, his blonde hair falling across his face as he looked down at his drum kit with something approaching shame. They had worked so hard to get here, rehearsed until their fingers bled, and for what? To perform for 6 strangers who looked more interested in their drinks than their music? John, ever the quiet one, simply gestured toward the sparse crowd with a look that said everything. He had joined this band believing in their potential, but nights like this made him question whether potential was enough. The business student in him understood numbers, and these numbers told a clear story of commercial failure. Why waste energy on an audience that barely filled a dinner table? But as his bandmates voiced their doubts, Freddie's response came not in words but in action. He walked to the microphone, his movements deliberate and confident, his hand wrapped around the stand with the same reverence he might show a sacred object. When he finally spoke, his voice carried none of the disappointment his bandmates felt. Instead, there was something else entirely, something that seemed to transform the very air around them. He turned back to Brian, Roger, and John, and his words were simple but absolute. They would perform tonight, not because the crowd deserved it, but because the music deserved it. Not because it would make them famous, but because this was who they were. Performers, artists, people who had something to say, whether 6 people were listening or 600,000. The size of the audience, he insisted, could never diminish the size of their responsibility to their craft. His conviction was unshakable. Every person in that room, he argued, had made the effort to come out on a weeknight, to spend their money, to give their time. They had chosen this pub, this band, this moment over countless other options. That alone made them worthy of everything Queen had to offer. He spoke of audiences not as numbers to be impressed, but as individuals to be honored. Each person represented a complete universe of experiences, hopes, and dreams, and they deserved to witness greatness regardless of their quantity. The transformation in Freddie was visible. The disappointment that might have crushed another performer seemed to fuel something deeper in him. His shoulders squared, his breathing deepened, and his entire presence began to expand beyond his physical form. This wasn't just about performing anymore. This was about proving something to himself, to his bandmates, and to anyone willing to witness it. This was about establishing what it meant to be Freddie Mercury. He reminded them of why they had started playing music in the first place. It wasn't for crowds or money or fame, though those things might come. It was because they had something inside them that demanded expression. Music was their language, their truth, their gift to the world. And gifts, he insisted, should be given freely and completely, regardless of who was there to receive them. The 6 people in the audience hadn't diminished the value of their music. They had simply made it more intimate, more personal, more precious. As Freddie spoke, something began to shift in his bandmates. Brian straightened his shoulders, remembering the countless hours he had spent perfecting his guitar technique, building his instrument with his father, dreaming of moments exactly like this one. Roger felt his hands tighten around his drumsticks, the familiar weight reminding him of every beat that had driven him since childhood. John looked at his bass, the instrument that had become an extension of his very soul, and realized that its voice deserved to be heard regardless of audience size. But it was Freddie's final argument that sealed their fate that night. He looked each of his bandmates in the eye and spoke about legacy, about the kind of performers they wanted to become. Did they want to be the type of band that only gave their best when conditions were perfect? Did they want to be artists who measured their effort by external validation? Or did they want to be the kind of performers who brought fire to every stage, passion to every song, commitment to every moment, regardless of circumstances? The choice, he told them, would define not just this night, but every night that followed, because audiences could sense authenticity. They could feel when a performer was holding back, when effort was conditional, when passion was measured by attendance. But they could also sense the opposite. When a performer was giving everything, when the music came from a place of pure truth, when the stage became a sacred space where something real was happening. In that moment, standing in a nearly empty pub with everything to prove and nothing to lose, 24-year-old Freddie Mercury taught his bandmates a lesson that would define their entire career. He showed them that greatness wasn't about the size of the stage or the roar of the crowd. It was about the fire within, the commitment to excellence, the refusal to let circumstances diminish the power of their gift. And as the lights remained dim and the 6 audience members waited unknowingly to witness history, Queen prepared to perform as if the world was watching. In a cramped pub in North London, with cigarette smoke hanging thick in the air and the scent of stale beer clinging to every surface, 6 people sat scattered across a room that could hold 200. The year was 1970, and Queen was about to perform their 3rd professional gig to their smallest audience yet. Backstage, if you could call the cluttered storage room behind the makeshift stage a backstage area, tensions were running high. Brian May clutched his homemade guitar, the Red Special, and shook his head in disbelief. Roger Taylor slumped against a crate of empty bottles, his drumsticks dangling from his fingers like defeated flags. John Deacon, the newest member of their quartet, stood quietly in the corner, wondering if he had made the right decision joining this struggling band. The venue owner had already apologized twice, explaining that the other band on the bill had canceled last minute, taking most of the expected crowd with them. The few souls who remained had wandered in seeking shelter from the London drizzle, or were nursing pints with nowhere else to go on a Tuesday night. Among them sat a young woman with a notepad, her pen poised but her expectations low. Brian was the first to voice what they were all thinking. Why perform for 6 people when they could pack up their equipment and save themselves the embarrassment? The amplifiers alone cost more to hire than they would earn from tonight's performance. Roger nodded in agreement, already reaching for his cymbal case. Even John, despite his quiet nature, seemed ready to call it a night. But Freddie Mercury, still known to his family as Farrokh Bulsara, stood in the center of that cramped room like a statue of defiance. At 24, he possessed an unwavering belief in something his bandmates couldn't yet see. While they counted empty chairs, he saw potential. Where they heard disappointed murmurs, he heard an audience waiting to be transported. He adjusted his already flamboyant shirt, ran his fingers through his dark hair, and looked each of his bandmates in the eye. His voice, when he spoke, carried a conviction that seemed to fill the small space. They would perform, he declared, not because of the size of the audience, but because of what they owed to their craft and to themselves. 6 people or 6,000, the music deserved to be played with everything they had. The others exchanged glances, recognizing something in Freddie's stance that they had witnessed before but never quite understood. It wasn't arrogance or naivety. It was something deeper, a fundamental belief that every performance was a sacred contract between artist and audience, regardless of numbers. As they prepared to take the stage, Freddie began his transformation. The nervous energy that had filled the storage room gave way to something electric. He straightened his posture, lifted his chin, and seemed to grow taller before their eyes. The shy art student from Ealing College disappeared, replaced by someone who commanded attention simply by existing in the space. The makeshift stage creaked under their equipment as they set up. The pub's single spotlight cast harsh shadows across their faces, and the sound system crackled with the promise of feedback. But Freddie positioned himself at the microphone as if he were about to address Wembley Stadium. His hands found the mic stand with the reverence of a conductor approaching his orchestra. In the audience, the 6 patrons looked up with varying degrees of interest. An elderly man nursing his 4th pint of bitter barely glanced their way. 2 young couples continued their conversations, using the impending music as background to their own dramas. But the young woman with the notepad set down her pen and focused her attention on the stage. Something was about to happen. She could feel it in the way the lead singer held himself, in the electricity that seemed to radiate from his presence. Her job as an assistant to a record executive had taught her to recognize moments when ordinary became extraordinary, and every instinct told her this was one of those moments. As the first chord rang out, piercing the smoky air with crystalline clarity, Freddie's voice joined the instruments not as accompaniment but as their leader. He sang as if the empty chairs were filled with thousands of devoted fans. His body moved with the music, every gesture calculated yet spontaneous, every note delivered with the passion of someone performing at the most important venue in the world. The elderly man's conversation with the bartender faded into silence. The young couples turned toward the stage, their personal dramas momentarily forgotten. The woman with the notepad leaned forward, her pen moving rapidly across the paper as she tried to capture what she was witnessing. Freddie commanded that nearly empty room with an authority that defied logic. He didn't perform for 6 people. He performed for the music itself, for the art that demanded expression regardless of its audience. And in doing so, he transformed not just the space around him, but everyone in it. In a dimly lit corner pub in London, 1970, 24-year-old Freddie Mercury stood before the most challenging audience of his young career. 6 people, 6 souls scattered across wooden chairs and bar stools, in a venue that could hold 200. The rain hammered against grimy windows as cigarette smoke curled toward water-stained ceilings. His bandmates exchanged glances that spoke volumes about their shared embarrassment. Roger Taylor shifted behind his drum kit, his sticks tapping an anxious rhythm against his thigh. Brian May adjusted his guitar strap for the third time, his curly hair catching the amber light from a flickering bulb. John Deacon stood motionless, bass in hand, waiting for a decision that would define more than just this particular evening. The venue manager had apologized profusely, explaining how the advertised opening act had canceled last minute, how the weather had kept people away, how perhaps they should reschedule for a better night. The sparse crowd looked up expectantly, some nursing warm beer, others checking their watches. In that moment, with the weight of potential humiliation pressing down like the London fog outside, Freddie Mercury made a choice that would echo through the corridors of rock history. He straightened his shoulders, adjusted the microphone stand with the precision of a conductor preparing for Carnegie Hall, and declared to his bandmates that they would perform as if the Royal Albert Hall was packed to capacity. What happened next defied every conventional rule about audience energy and performer psychology. Instead of scaling down their ambitions to match the intimate setting, Freddie transformed that nearly empty pub into his personal theater of dreams. He prowled the small stage with the confidence of a lion, claiming his territory, his voice soaring through octaves that seemed to expand the very walls of the cramped venue. When he belted out their early compositions, his vocal power was so commanding that conversations at the bar ceased entirely. The 6 audience members found themselves leaning forward, drawn into an orbit of charisma that transcended the humble surroundings. Brian May later recalled how watching Freddie that night was like witnessing a masterclass in the alchemy of performance. Here was a young man who understood something profound about the relationship between artist and audience. Size, he seemed to believe, was irrelevant. Connection was everything. Each gesture was deliberate, each note delivered with the conviction that these 6 people deserved nothing less than his absolute best. He moved between songs with theatrical flourishes that would have seemed absurd in such an intimate setting, yet somehow felt perfectly natural when filtered through his magnetic presence. Among those 6 witnesses sat a woman who had ducked into the pub purely by chance, seeking shelter from the relentless downpour that had caught her unprepared during her evening walk. Sarah. Collins worked as an assistant to Marcus Reed, one of London's most influential record executives, though she kept this fact to herself as she settled into a corner table with a cup of tea. Her notebook, always present for jotting down meeting notes and appointment reminders, lay open beside her as she initially planned to wait out the storm. She had no particular interest in rock music, preferring the classical recordings that filled her small flat, but something about the earnest preparation happening on stage caught her attention. When Freddie began to sing, Sarah's pen paused mid-sentence in whatever mundane list she had been composing. His voice carried a quality she had never encountered before, a combination of technical precision and raw emotional power that seemed to bypass her analytical mind and speak directly to something deeper. She found herself studying his movements, the way he commanded space, how he made eye contact with each member of his tiny audience as if they were intimate friends sharing a private concert. Her notebook forgotten, she watched this young performer transform a potentially demoralizing situation into something approaching magical. The set list that evening included early versions of songs that would later become anthems for millions. Keep Yourself Alive rang out with prophetic intensity, while My Fairy King showcased the theatrical sensibilities that would define Queen's future aesthetic. But it was during a passionate rendition of Liar that Sarah truly understood she was witnessing something extraordinary. Freddie's voice climbed to impossible heights, his body language shifting from vulnerable confession to defiant proclamation within the span of a single verse. The other band members, initially reluctant, began feeding off his energy, their playing becoming more confident, more adventurous. As the evening progressed, the dynamic in the room shifted dramatically. The 6 audience members were no longer passive observers, but active participants in an intimate musical conversation. A middle-aged couple at the bar began swaying gently to the rhythm. 2 university students abandoned their textbooks entirely, their attention completely captured. An elderly gentleman nursing a whiskey raised his glass in salute during a particularly powerful vocal passage. The venue's acoustics, designed for conversation rather than performance, seemed to wrap around Freddie's voice like a perfectly tailored garment. Sarah watched this transformation with professional fascination. In her work with Marcus Reed, she had attended countless industry showcases and recording sessions, observing established artists who commanded vast audiences and million-dollar contracts. Yet none had demonstrated this particular quality that Freddie possessed, this ability to make every person in his vicinity feel simultaneously insignificant and utterly important. She began taking notes not about her work schedule, but about what she was witnessing. The way he held sustained notes seemed to suspend time itself. His stage presence filled spaces far beyond the physical boundaries of the small platform. When the final song ended, the silence that followed was profound and reverent. The 6 audience members erupted in enthusiastic applause that sounded like hundreds in the intimate space. Freddie bowed deeply, thanking them with genuine warmth, speaking to each person as if they had traveled great distances specifically to hear Queen perform. His bandmates, initially skeptical of performing for such a small crowd, now stood with evident pride, understanding they had participated in something significant, though they could not yet articulate exactly what that something was. As the band began packing their equipment, Sarah found herself lingering, reluctant to return to the rain-soaked streets outside. She approached the small stage area where Freddie was carefully coiling microphone cables, his post-performance energy still radiating from him like heat from a furnace. When she introduced herself, mentioning that she worked in the music industry, his eyes lit up with curiosity rather than the calculated interest she typically encountered from aspiring musicians. They began talking about the evening's performance, about music in general, about the curious alchemy that transforms sound into emotion. Sarah discovered that Freddie possessed not only extraordinary vocal abilities, but also a sophisticated understanding of music history and theory. He spoke passionately about opera singers like Aretha Franklin, about the theatrical traditions that influenced his stage persona, about his vision for what rock music could become if artists were willing to push beyond conventional boundaries. His knowledge was encyclopedic yet never pretentious, delivered with infectious enthusiasm that made even complex musical concepts accessible and exciting. She found herself genuinely engaged in a conversation that stretched well past the time she had initially planned to spend in this humble venue. As their discussion continued, Sarah realized she was experiencing something unprecedented in her professional life. Usually, her interactions with musicians were filtered through industry protocols, contract negotiations, and strategic career considerations. But this impromptu conversation with Freddie felt refreshingly honest and unguarded. He asked thoughtful questions about the music business, demonstrating both ambition and genuine curiosity about how the industry functioned. More importantly, he listened carefully to her responses, treating her insights with respect rather than viewing her merely as a potential connection to be exploited. When Freddie mentioned Queen's struggles to secure recording opportunities and meaningful gigs, Sarah found herself genuinely wanting to help. Not because she sensed a profitable investment opportunity, but because she had witnessed firsthand the transformative power of his artistry. She had watched him turn a potentially humiliating situation into a triumph of creative determination. The evening had demonstrated qualities that no recording contract or marketing campaign could manufacture: authentic talent, unwavering commitment, and that indefinable charisma that separates true artists from mere entertainers. Before leaving the pub that night, Sarah carefully wrote down the band's contact information in her notebook, the same notebook that had been forgotten during Freddie's mesmerizing performance. She promised to mention Queen to Marcus Reed, though she was careful not to oversell the potential outcome of such a conversation. The music industry, she explained, was notoriously unpredictable, filled with talented artists who never received the recognition they deserved. But something about this evening felt different, charged with possibility in ways that transcended ordinary professional networking. As Sarah finally stepped back into the London night, the rain had softened to a gentle mist. The streets glistened under streetlights like a stage set waiting for the next performance. Behind her, the nearly empty pub returned to its usual quiet rhythm of conversation and clinking glasses, but the memory of Freddie's voice still seemed to linger in the air like incense after a ceremony. She walked home with purposeful steps, already formulating how she would describe this extraordinary young performer to her boss, already imagining the conversation that might change everything for a band that had just proved they could turn 6 strangers into believers with nothing more than talent, determination, and an unshakable faith in their own artistic vision. The venue was empty. 6 people sat scattered across a pub that could hold 200. The smell of stale beer and cigarette smoke hung in the air like a shroud over broken dreams. Behind the makeshift stage, 3 young men stood frozen in disbelief, staring out at the handful of faces that represented their entire audience for the evening. This was not how they had imagined their journey to stardom would unfold. It was 1970, and Queen was still a whisper of what they would become. Roger Taylor adjusted his drum kit nervously, the metallic clangs echoing through the nearly empty space. Brian May tuned his guitar for the 3rd time, his fingers trembling slightly as he watched potential audience members walk past the pub's windows without a second glance. John Deacon stood quietly in the corner, his bass guitar slung over his shoulder, wondering if they had made a terrible mistake pursuing music as more than just a hobby. But Freddie Mercury stood different from the rest. While his bandmates contemplated packing up their equipment and calling it a night, Freddie examined those 6 faces with the intensity of a general surveying his troops before battle. His dark eyes moved from person to person, cataloging each individual as if they were the most important audience he would ever perform for. He wore a simple white shirt that night, nothing like the elaborate costumes that would later become his trademark, yet something electric already pulsed beneath the surface. The pub owner approached the band with an apologetic expression, ready to offer them their fee for the evening and send them home. The logical choice would have been to accept the gesture gracefully, pack up their instruments, and try again another night when the weather might be better and the crowds more willing to venture out. Even successful bands had canceled shows for smaller crowds than this. It would have been understandable, forgivable, and entirely reasonable. Freddie Mercury was never particularly interested in being reasonable. He turned to his bandmates with a look that would become legendary among those who knew him best, a combination of absolute determination and barely contained creative fire. Without saying a word, he communicated something that would define not just this evening, but the very essence of what Queen would become as a band. They were going to perform as if Madison Square Garden was packed to capacity. They were going to give these 6 people the show of their lives. The decision seemed absurd to everyone except Freddie. Roger Taylor later recalled feeling embarrassed by the small crowd, worried that performing with full intensity would seem desperate or delusional. Brian May wondered if they should save their energy for a more worthy audience. But Freddie had already made up his mind, and when Freddie Mercury made up his mind about a performance, the universe seemed to bend around his will. Among those 6 audience members sat a young woman named Patricia Williams, though she used her nickname Pat in professional settings. She worked as an assistant to Marcus Robinson, a mid-level executive at a small but ambitious record label called Trident Records. Pat had stumbled into the pub by accident, seeking shelter from the London rain while walking home from a late dinner with friends. She had no intention of staying for a concert, certainly no expectation of witnessing anything memorable. Pat was 22 years old, fresh out of university with a degree in English literature and dreams of working in the music industry that seemed perpetually out of reach. Her job at Trident Records involved mostly filing, answering phones, and fetching coffee for executives who rarely acknowledged her presence. She had been hoping to catch the attention of her boss with her insights about emerging talent, but opportunities to prove herself remained frustratingly rare. The other 5 audience members were equally unimpressive from a business perspective. 2 were regulars at the pub who had simply decided to stick around out of curiosity. One was the girlfriend of the sound engineer, obligated to attend but clearly more interested in the drink in her hand than the music about to unfold. Another was a friend of Roger Taylor's from dental school, present more out of loyalty than genuine interest in the band's musical ambitions. The final audience member was an older gentleman who had wandered in seeking refuge from the weather, much like Pat herself. This was not the audience that dreams are made of. This was not the crowd that launches careers or validates years of struggle and sacrifice. This was the kind of gathering that breaks spirits and sends aspiring musicians back to their day jobs with their tails between their legs. But Freddie Mercury had never measured his worth by conventional standards, and he was not about to start on this rainy evening in an empty London pub. As the band took their positions on stage, something shifted in the atmosphere of the room. Freddie walked to the microphone with the confidence of a man addressing thousands, his posture straight, his presence commanding despite the intimate setting. He looked out at those 6 faces and smiled, not the nervous grimace of a performer trying to make the best of a bad situation, but the genuine, radiant smile of an artist who had found his true audience. The first song exploded from the stage with an energy that seemed impossible given the circumstances. Freddie's voice soared through the small space, rich and powerful, treating each note as if it were being broadcast across the world. Brian May's guitar work was precise and passionate, every riff played with the dedication of someone performing at Wembley Stadium. Roger Taylor attacked his drums with fierce concentration, and John Deacon's bass lines provided a foundation that was both solid and inspired. But it was Freddie who transformed the evening from a mere concert into something approaching magic. He moved across the small stage as if it were vast, his gestures grand and theatrical without ever seeming ridiculous or overblown. He engaged with each audience member individually, making eye contact, directing verses towards specific people, creating an intimacy that felt both personal and universal. Pat Williams found herself leaning forward in her chair, her drink forgotten, her initial plan to leave quickly evaporating in the face of what she was witnessing. She had attended dozens of concerts in her young life, had seen established bands perform for packed venues, but she had never encountered anything quite like this. Here was a performer who refused to allow external circumstances to diminish the power of his art, who treated 6 strangers in a nearly empty pub as if they were the most important audience in the world. The band performed for over an hour, running through their entire repertoire with an intensity that seemed to bend reality around them. Freddie's between-song banter was charming and confident, his interactions with the small crowd warm and genuine. He told stories, shared jokes, and created an atmosphere of intimacy that made each person in the audience feel like they were witnessing something special and private. As the evening progressed, something extraordinary began to happen. The 6 audience members, initially scattered and disconnected, began to coalesce into a real crowd. They moved closer to the stage, began responding to Freddie's cues, started clapping and singing along to songs they were hearing for the first time. The energy in the room built steadily, fed by the band's unwavering commitment to excellence and Freddie's magnetic stage presence. Pat Williams watched this transformation with growing amazement. She had studied music business in university, had read countless case studies about successful bands and their rise to fame, but nothing had prepared her for witnessing raw talent of this magnitude in such an intimate setting. She began taking mental notes, composing the report she would give to Marcus Robinson, knowing that she was seeing something that would be important to remember. The final song of the evening was an early version of what would later become one of Queen's signature pieces. Freddie's voice reached heights that seemed impossible in the small space, supported by harmonies from Brian and Roger that created a wall of sound both powerful and delicate. The music filled every corner of the pub, transforming the shabby venue into something approaching a cathedral. When the last note faded, the 6 audience members erupted in applause that sounded like the roar of thousands. They cheered, whistled, and demanded an encore with enthusiasm that would have been impressive from a crowd 10 times their size. Freddie bowed deeply, his face glowing with satisfaction and joy as if he had just conquered the world's most prestigious venue. As the band packed up their equipment, Pat Williams approached Freddie directly. She introduced herself, explained her connection to Trident Records, and asked if the band had representation. The conversation was brief but significant, a moment of connection between an emerging talent and someone who might have the power to change everything. Freddie was gracious but not desperate, confident but not arrogant, leaving Pat with the impression of someone who expected success rather than hoped for it. The following morning, Pat Williams walked into Marcus Robinson's office with a sense of purpose she had never experienced before. She had spent the night thinking about what she had witnessed, analyzing not just the music, but the entire experience of watching Freddie Mercury refuse to compromise his artistic vision regardless of circumstances. She knew she was about to make the most important recommendation of her young career. Marcus Robinson was initially skeptical when Pat began describing the previous evening's events. A nearly empty pub venue seemed like an unlikely birthplace for the next big thing in music, and he had heard countless assistants make bold claims about unknown bands they had discovered. But as Pat continued her detailed account, something in her tone and conviction began to capture his attention. She described Freddie's stage presence with